Anna Castellino. I'm one of the dietitians and diabetes educators here at Pro Healthcare, and I get to talk about sugars, artificial sweeteners, all the different kinds of sugar products that are out there on the market because there are a lot of options, and I know it can be really confusing. So hopefully we're going to provide some clarity and transparency into our food system and specifically regarding sugars within our food. So where is the sugar? We generally can break it up into two kind of overarching categories. We've got naturally occurring sugars and added sugars. And when we talk about sugar concerns within the American food system, we're really concerned about those added sugars. I just read a statistic that about 75% of our food products outside of chicken breasts and apple, that type of stuff, but anything that might come in a box package bag that is processed, about 75% of those foods contain at least a little bit of added sugar. So it's really everywhere. Naturally occurring sugars that we find in our fruits, vegetables, whole grains, or milk products is less of a concern because those naturally occurring sugars are coming in a package that's really meant to be eaten within that package. You think of something like an apple. Well, an apple is sweet and it does provide us some natural sugars, but it also comes with fiber from the skin, and that red color that's on the or green color that comes from the skin is different vitamins and minerals and phytonutrients and antioxidants. And so it's coming in a package that comes with some other goodies. Whereas added sugars are going to be things that we're going to find in those highly processed foods, candies, sodas, cupcakes, pies, syrups. These don't generally come within a package that has other nutrients, other fiber or protein or vitamins or minerals. And so we're just really getting this heavy dose of just straight processed sugar. So do know that we are talking about two different categories. Naturally occurring sugars are less of a concern, and today we're really going to focus on those added sugar concerns and those added sugar foods. So where can we find sugar? Well, when we look at an ingredient list on a food package or bag, you're going to be able to spot if it's hidden in there. We are going to look at some nutrition labels today, and I will preface it with there are rounding rules. So if the threshold for the amount of sugar is below a certain threshold, it technically can be listed as 0, but it doesn't mean that that product is completely void of any added sugar. So these are some really common ones that you might see on an ingredient list. Those first 6 that are listed, sucrose, fructose, maltose, dextrose, lactose, and galactose, you can see they all have something in common, and their word ends in OSE. This is going to be an indication of a sugar compound. Now, things like corn syrup, molasses, agave, honey, these are going to be a more complete food, right, or an actual complete item, not just that simple sugar molecule or compound that we would get from something like sucrose. But those are some really common names that you can keep an eye out for on those ingredient lists to know if there is any type of added sugar, because very commonly it's not just going to say sugar. And I'll give you a little tidbit. A lot of times food manufacturers will use various types of sugar so that when you read that ingredient list, those items or those ingredients can be further down the ingredient list, because we know that it goes in descending order. So the things that are listed first, second, third on an ingredient list are what makes up the majority or kind of highest weight of that food. Well, if they can use table sugar and they can use honey and they can use agave, but they use a third, a third, a third, well, now those can be farther down on the ingredient list, even though a good bit of that product could just be sugar compound. So keep that in mind, that you are going to be looking for multiple words, not just the word sugar. So when we look at this ingredient list, please know that sugar is a type of carbohydrate. So I work in diabetes education and I get this question a lot. Folks that are concerned about their blood sugars are really trying to cut back. We need to remember that all carbohydrates can have an impact on blood sugars. And so when we look at either one of these nutrition facts labels, you're going to see that sugar is not bolded, it's just regular font, and it's indented underneath total carbohydrate being all the way to the left of the label and bolded in its font text. So Fiber and sugars are types of carbs, and those values that are listed. So let's look at the one on the left. That 1 gram of sugar that's listed is included within the total carbohydrate amount of 37 grams. Most commonly speaking, there's 3 types of carbs. You have fiber, starches, and sugars. Good news is that the FDA requires that sugar be a line item on our nutrition facts labels so that we can see how much sugar is part of that total carb amount. Now, the good news is we're currently transitioning to a new label formatting in the United States, which is the one that you see on the right-hand side there. Calories are much larger, but I've also highlighted in that yellow box, we have a new line item. Includes X number of grams of added sugars. So now the FDA is requiring food manufacturers to give us transparency into of the sugar that is in a product, how much was added by the food manufacturer versus how much was naturally occurring. So in this example on the right-hand side, we can see that for 2/3 cup serving of whatever this is, let's pretend that it's yogurt, flavored yogurt. For every 2/3 cup that we eat, of the 37 grams of total carbs, 12 of those 37 are sugars. Now, 10 of the 12 were added by the yogurt company. 2 of the 12 could represent lactose, the milk sugar that is naturally found in milk, and yogurt being made from milk. It's very common, and you're going to see sugar even in plain yogurt because there's lactose in it. So this would tell me that 10 of those 12 grams are coming from the strawberry flavor or the fruit on the bottom or whatever type of sugar they may have added. Ideally, we're keeping those added sugars as close to zero as possible because we really want to, again, be focusing on those naturally occurring sugars as much as we can. Now, if you still see the label format on the left out in the marketplace, which you absolutely will, these are 2 different labels, but let's pretend that the sugars were 12 grams. We just don't know on the old format of those 12 what are naturally occurring and what are added. Whereas when you see this new label format, and you always know that you're looking at the new label format based on the font size of calories, you can see there's a very large difference. So if you see that number really, really big, you know that you're looking at that new label format, and you should be looking down to see how many added sugars and are there lower added sugar alternatives if indeed you find one that is pretty high. For those folks that look at percent daily value, you will see that for those 10 grams of added sugars, they're saying that meets 20% of your needs. General recommendation is no more than 50 grams of added sugar a day. Anything less than that, all the better, but the recommendation right now is a max of 50. So you can see that of those 50 grams, Americans far exceed that. On average, we're eating about 95 grams of added sugar a day. And over the course of the year, that adds up to about 77 pounds of added sugar that's just coming from either obvious things that are listed there, right? Whether that be sodas or candies or ice creams or sweet treats. But there's also going to be those hidden sugars and things that don't necessarily taste sweet. For example, pizza or pasta sauce. A lot of added sugars in something like that, but it doesn't have an overtly sweet taste like, you know, a piece of pie or cake would. So we're getting it not only from the things that we're eating that are sugary, but also things that are hidden, which is why it's so important that we're reading those ingredient lists and we're looking at those nutrition facts labels to make sure that we're choosing products that have lower added sugars so that we can stay within that max recommendation of no more than 50. We got to cut that back by about 50%. Why is it so important that we consider added sugars and cut it back? Well, from a nutritional perspective, they show that when folks have a higher sugar diet, you're at a greater risk for nutrient deficiencies because you're not eating other things that would give you the vitamins, the minerals, the antioxidants, fiber, protein, right? Let's say that for breakfast, we're going to go and grab a donut. Well, if the alternative was steel cut oats with walnuts and blueberries, when we look at not just the carbs or the sugars between those two, we can look at the other nutrients that that donut isn't providing us in terms of fiber from the oats, antioxidants from the blueberries, you know, fiber from the walnuts, healthy fats from the walnuts. we're missing out on all of that. And if we're doing this day after day, meal after meal, we're just putting ourselves at risk for not meeting all of those nutrient needs from things other than sugar. Cavities, we know that sugar produces bacterial growth that then can produce acid that eats away at the enamel. And when the enamel on our teeth wears away, it gets down to just basically the bone, and it puts us at greater risk for developing cavities. And I put on here obesity, not because sugar makes us fat. It's just that when we consume high amounts of sugar, they're generally coming within a higher calorie food. And if we are exceeding our daily caloric needs, because we're eating these higher sugar foods, and let's get real, that donut's not going to satisfy or keep us full the same way that those steel cut oats or an egg omelet would. So an hour later, we're going back to snack or we're going back to eat something else. Sugar just doesn't stay with us as long. So it's a lot easier for us to exceed our daily caloric needs when we are consuming a lot of higher sugar foods. And so that does put us at risk for gaining weight and potentially over time leading to obesity. I also have some extra notes here that there's some newer research that's showing a relationship between a high added sugar diet and hypertension and heart disease. So that's another consideration. A lot of times when we talk about hypertension or high blood pressure, we hear a lot about salt, but there's some new research coming out about the relationship to high sugar intake. And when we know that heart disease is the #1 killer of both men and women in the United States, something that we don't want to just shy away from, we want to take seriously. Also know that a high sugar diet can lead to an increase in insulin resistance. And when we talk about type 2 diabetes rates out there in the population, they are increasing. Type 2 diabetes is characterized by insulin resistance. So when we consume a lot of sugar, our body responds by sending out insulin from our pancreas to take care of those blood sugars that are created. But when the body is sending out high levels of insulin, our cells can kind of get desensitized to that insulin. And so they just don't work as well. And that's where we start to see some of that insulin resistance. So when we talk about added sugars and certainly over consuming our needs on added sugars, it's impacting a lot of different parts of our body that we need to be mindful of. So when we talk about nutrient density or really getting the most bang for our buck with our foods, we really want to focus on high nutrient dense foods. And these are basically low calorie foods that are jam packed with nutrients that our body needs, right? So if we take something like broccoli, 1 cup is about 25 calories, but you're getting vitamins A, C, potassium, folate, fiber. There's water content in there versus low nutrient dense foods. More commonly, we hear empty calories. These are higher calorie foods that don't come with this laundry list of additional nutrients that our body can actually benefit from. So we think of a can of soda, right? It's going to give us a lot of calories. It's going to give us carbs and sugar, but we're not getting any vitamins A, C, iron, potassium. We're not getting those things that our body actually wants. We really want to make sure that we're focusing on high nutrient dense foods as much as possible to get the most bang for our buck. We also want to be mindful of a glycemic response. Basically, what this means is how quickly our bodies are able to produce blood sugar from the things that we eat. So a food with a high glycemic response or high glycemic index is going to create blood sugars very rapidly. So for example, since I work in diabetes education, one of the things that I teach folks is if they have low blood sugars, how to treat them. Well, one of the best things to do is to drink a little bit of soda because it only takes 15 minutes from the time that soda hits your lips to the time your body is able to start making blood sugars from the sugar in that soda. 15 minutes from mouth to bloodstream. Very, very quick versus something like broccoli going to make far less blood sugars and it's going to take a lot more time. So broccoli would be a low glycemic index or low glycemic response food. Ideally, we are focusing more on those low glycemic response foods, not only because they lead to more desirable blood sugar management, it also generally will keep us fuller longer because it takes longer for our body to fully digest them, to get them out of the stomach, through our intestine, get the energy that we need from them so we aren't left hungry an hour later. Going back to the breakfast example between those steel cut oats versus the donut. The steel cut oats with the walnuts and the blueberries are going to have a lower glycemic response than that donut will. Well, not only is that balanced oatmeal breakfast going to keep our blood sugars more level than the donut, it's going to stick with us longer. So an hour or two later, we aren't looking around to start snacking on something, whereas that donut, our body was super efficient at breaking it down, digesting it, turning it into blood sugars, and now it's left hungry again. So we really, really want to focus on those low glycemic foods. And so you can see a basic example here. Straight glucose. So we think of something like glucose tabs, which is another way to treat low blood sugars with folks in diabetes. Pure glucose tabs. Boom, they're going to have a very high glycemic response because they're glucose. We're turning them into blood glucose. Rice is a much higher starch-based carbohydrate. It does not have sugar in it. Our body is able to convert those starch compounds within those rice kernels to blood glucose or blood sugar, but we can see that it does it at a slower rate and not so steep. And then we think of something like lentils or beans. These are much higher in fiber. They have an overall lower carbohydrate amount, have some starch. They don't have any sugar compounds in there. They are still going to impact our blood sugar, but they do so at an even slower or lower glycemic response. So we really want to make sure that when we are consuming our carbohydrate foods, that we're getting the most bang for our buck and we're doing it with lower glycemic index foods. We think of something like that apple that I mentioned at the beginning versus apple juice. An apple is going to have a lower glycemic index than straight apple juice, not only because it's a solid food that requires our body to physically break down into smaller digestible pieces, but it also has the fiber from the skin. It is going to be a more complete food versus apple juice is liquid sugar, right? It's just the sugar compounds. We've taken all the juice out of the apple. We've removed all of the fiber that would come from the skin or kind of the meat of the apple. And now we have this liquid sugar that our body is really efficient at converting to blood sugars. And so naturally, that's going to lead to a higher glycemic response, just a faster and higher blood sugar. Now, different foods are going to have different effects. So, like I mentioned, an apple, lentils, rice, whatever that might be, we also can kind of not manipulate, but help along a food that might have a higher glycemic response by incorporating it with other things. So, some of the things that impact the overall glycemic response in foods are fiber content. The higher the fiber, generally the lower the glycemic index, or the softer that blood sugar response is going to be because fiber is going to digest at a slower rate. When we can have fat and protein in that mixed meal or with that food. So for example, the apple, and now we add peanut butter to it. Well, we know that the apple juice, because it's pure sugar, is going to turn into blood sugar the quickest. The apple itself, because it's got the fiber, because it's a whole food, we have to chew it a little bit lower. And now we add peanut butter, which is a higher fat or protein food, is going to lower that glycemic index even further to create an even softer blood sugar response so that we don't get that quick rise. Food processing, so the more processed a food is, generally the higher the glycemic index or glycemic response will be, which is why we really want to focus on whole unprocessed foods as much as possible and be incredibly discerning when we are purchasing things that are coming out of packages. Now, that's not to say that we can't find really high quality canned vegetables, right? Or frozen fruits and vegetables that are coming in a package, but we want to make sure that we're checking that ingredient list, checking those nutrition facts labels to make sure that they haven't added in a whole bunch of added sugar. And then the mixture of foods in a meal. To sit down and just eat a plate of rice, it's going to do one thing. Well, now we choose something like brown rice or wild rice, higher fiber content. That's going to lower the glycemic response. Then we add chicken to that, or we add avocado into that. We add a protein, we add a fat. These are all things that can help to kind of level off or lighten the load of that glycemic response so that we can get these nice, soft and even blood sugars so that we're not doing the bebop up and down. Not only is that going to benefit us in terms of insulin resistance and sensitivity, but it's also going to help keep our mood and energy levels a lot more consistent throughout the day versus riding the roller coaster if I've got a high blood sugar and then I drop and then I need going up and down by choosing some of those or more of those added sugar type foods. So, can we eat sugar? Absolutely. We just want to make sure that we're doing it in the right amounts. Like I mentioned, general recommendation is no more than 50 grams in a day, which you will see listed. I have a couple more specific recommendations that I'll go over men versus women. But you can see that that equates to about 5 to 10% of total calorie intake from sugar. The lower that we can keep that, the better off we are because it's just freeing up more calories and more food in the diet to get more of those nutrient dense foods, get more bang for our buck, help our blood sugar control, really just benefit us all around. So, specific recommendations from the USDA show 3 teaspoons of added sugar for a 1600 calorie diet. And see that it goes on. So, depending on your activity level, your height, your weight, what your weight loss or weight gain goals might be, everybody's calorie needs per day vary. So, you can see that this is kind of listed out based on what your needs are, what the recommendation is. The American Heart Association has a general recommendation of no more than 6 teaspoons a day for women, which equates to about no more than 100 calories of added sugars a day, versus for men, they say no more than 9 teaspoons of sugar, or about 150 calories from added sugars a day. And then the World Health Organization has an even stricter or smaller recommendation, and they say about half of that 50, so no more than about 25 grams of added sugars in a day. Generally speaking, if you can just keep an eye on the foods that you have in your pantry and in your refrigerator, start to keep an eye out for that added sugar value, the sugars that are listed in the ingredient list, and start just dialing back, even if you're not doing specific recommendations in terms of those amounts. But let's say you're like the average that's doing 95 grams a day, and you can just start putting 5, and working closer to that 50, you're moving in the right direction. How many grams are in a teaspoon? Generally speaking, there are 4 grams of sugar in a teaspoon of sugar. Great question. All right, hidden sugars. Where are they hiding? Obviously, we know that sodas and juices and pies and cakes and candies have sugar. Well, we're going to find things or a lot of added sugars in things like I mentioned earlier that don't necessarily taste super sweet, like salad dressings. They don't have to be sweet. They can definitely be on the savor side or like a spicy side, but have a lot of added sugars. Generally speaking, spaghetti and pizza sauces have a lot of added sugars. Ketchup and barbecue sauce, I don't think anybody's too surprised. Those things do taste a little bit sweet. I did put on there reduced fat products. Keep in mind that food manufacturers can generally manipulate 3 things in food to give it flavor and have people want to buy it. And that is going to be sugar, salt, and fat. So when we purchase something that is reduced in sugar or reduced in fat or reduced in sodium, it can be that they have increased one of those other 2 to make that food still taste good. So for example, reduced fat peanut butter has less fat than your standard natural peanut butter, but when you look at the carbohydrate content, it is higher than a natural peanut butter because they've added in other carbs, including sugars, to give the peanut butter more flavor. That is flavorful. You take that out, you got to put something back in to make consumers want to buy the food. So please, please, if you see that they've cut back on something, I want a little light bulb to go off in your brain to say, I wonder, let me go be a detective and figure out if they've added in extra sugars or sugars to begin with to kind of balance out and make this food still taste good. Yogurts, like I mentioned earlier, even plain yogurt is going to have naturally occurring sugars because it's made from milk and milk has lactose in it. But it's when we add the vanilla, the blueberry, the strawberry, that type of thing. And one thing I will mention, because I get this question a lot in my office, is about lactose-free milk or lactose-free yogurt. Does that mean that it doesn't have carbs or sugar? And when you look at both the ingredient list and the nutrition facts label, you will indeed see that there are carbs and sugar in lactose-free products. And it's because they have not removed lactose. What they have done is add in the enzyme that is responsible for breaking down lactose in the GI system. So a person that can't do lactose is because their body doesn't produce any or enough lactase enzyme. This is an enzyme that the body can produce that's specifically there to break down lactose and make it digestible. When the body doesn't have enough or any of that lactase enzyme, it can lead to the GI issues that folks find when they can't do lactose: bloating, cramping, diarrhea, just issues because that lactose isn't getting digested. So what these lactose-free products have done is add in the enzyme into the milk carton, into the yogurt, into the cottage cheese, into the ice cream, into whatever, so that when you're eating it, you're eating that lactase enzyme at the same time so that it's able to digest it. But you're still going to be getting the lactose that's in the dairy product. So you're still getting the carbohydrate and you're still getting that natural sugar from the lactose that's in there. Do not think that it is a sugar-free option. Cereals, granola bars, obviously a variety of beverages, alcoholic beverages, they're putting in sugars to give them flavor, mixed drinks, that type of thing. So please, whenever possible, check that ingredient list, check your nutrition facts label, and make sure that what you're buying is what you think you are buying. You're not just buying a bunch of sugar hidden amongst, tomato in the pasta sauce. So, alternative sweeteners. So many folks have questions about, well, what are some alternatives to sugar? I really like sweet foods, or I'm still going to make pies and cakes, or I'm still going to put sugar in my tomato sauce because that's how grandma taught me to do it. So, what are some alternatives that are out there that are going to have less impact on my blood sugars or have less calories? I will preface this with all of the things I am about to say about these foods or about these sweeteners and products that are out there are FDA approved and considered generally safe. Now, everything in moderation. Everybody is sensitive to these different products differently because ultimately speaking, we're talking about processed sweeteners. Unless you have, and we'll get there, unless you have a stevia plant sitting on your windowsill in your kitchen, all of these things are processed products. Some are lab made, some originate from fruits or plants. They're still processed in a way so that you have this sweet product to purchase. So please just keep that in mind. The first one that I get a lot of questions about are sugar alcohols. And this can be a really confusing term because it's not technically a sugar and they're not technically alcohols. It's just that under a microscope and the way that we look at their compound is they've got similar characteristics of some sugar compounds and some alcohol compounds. But when we consume them, our body doesn't digest them the way that it digests sugar or the way that it digests alcohols. The way you know that you're looking at a sugar alcohol is if the word ends in OL, generally speaking. Erythritol, mannitol, sorbitol, xylitol. Anytime you see that OL, more often than not, is going to be that sugar alcohol. And the way that they're different or they are an alternative to regular sugar is because their compound, they're underneath the microscope, looks a little different. Our body doesn't recognize them and doesn't digest them the same way that we do, let's say, table sugar or sucrose. So most of the time, we're only going to get about 50% of the calories and the carbs from consuming these things. The other 50% of that compound goes through our GI system undigested and will come out the other end. Now, because they're not fully absorbed, they do eventually get fermented in the intestine, most of them do, and it's going to potentially, if we overdo it, cause some gas, bloating, and I've heard some horror stories from some of my patients where they didn't know all of this, and they were on a road trip, and they stopped at the gas station, and all their friends went in there to kind of get a snack or whatever. They found a sugar-free option, and they thought that it was going to be safe, and they just ate all those sugar-free chocolates. And because all of those sugar alcohols hit the system at one time and they weren't fully digested, it did lead to some issues on the other end. So please, please, my biggest recommendation for sugar alcohols is read the nutrition facts label. Whatever the serving size is listed, limit yourself to just that serving size so that you don't have any of these GI issues that can come with it. But generally, you are going to see them in things like sugar-free or sugarless gums. You'll find them in sugar-free candies and chocolates. There are sugar-free cookies out there. You'll find some sugar-free ice creams. More popular are sugar-free jellies and jams. So please, please, just make sure that you are checking that label and sticking with the posted serving size. Now, there's one specific product out there I will say I've never tried personally, but I do have clients that have, and I love it. It's called Swerve. So like I'm swerving on the highway. And this is a product that's made from erythritol, one of the sugar alcohols that's listed. And it's unique in that erythritol is not, about 90% of it is not absorbed and will be excreted from your body. So you can use this Swerve product in baking or in any of kind of your cooked dishes. And it's a sugar substitute, sugar alcohol, that still give you that same kind of sweetness, but because it's not absorbed or digested, it's not going to impact your blood sugars and you're not going to get any calories from it. I've heard people say that they found it at Pick and Save, general grocery stores out there, Woodman's, that kind of thing. So that might be something to kind of keep on your radar if you are looking for some sugar alternatives. All right, artificial sweeteners. I have a whole host of notes, an entire page of notes. I'm going to make sure I get through all of this because this one I get a lot about. Artificial sweeteners are what we call non-nutritive sweeteners. You see listed there your saccharins, aspartame, sucralose, otherwise known as Splenda. These are very popular out on the market. You do not, in theory, absorb these because the body doesn't recognize these compounds, and so they don't get digested and they pass through. So they shouldn't impact your blood sugars, and you shouldn't be getting any calories from them. They are synthetic or lab made, so they are not naturally occurring. They are test tube babies. And what I've seen most recently in the research for diabetes specific or glucose management is that because these items are not digested, they shouldn't impact your blood sugar on the front end. However, when we consume a high amount of artificial sweeteners day after day, right, we're not practicing that moderation, they get into our large intestine before they're excreted. And we're hearing so much more about probiotics, prebiotics, healthy gut, leaky gut, that whole microbiome conversation. Well, because these artificial sweeteners are not digested in the upper intestine, like other things would, they make their way all the way down to our lower intestine. And they can create a little bit of havoc down there. And I like to say they might wage a little bit of war on our healthy bacteria environment. So it is a smart idea to practice moderation when it comes to these sweeteners. General rule, I tell folks, count up the number of times in a day that you're consuming an artificial sweetener, take your non-negotiables and cut it by 50%. So if you're putting sugar-free creamer in your coffee and you're having a sugar-free yogurt with breakfast, and then you're doing some sugar-free cookies as a snack, and then you're doing it throughout the day, some Crystal Lights, whatever that might look like, count up all those times, pick the foods that you're like, I'm not willing to give up, but maybe try to find some alternatives for those other ones just to moderate the amount of times that you're introducing these into your system. So some notes on some of the most popular ones. Aspartame, been around for a while, a lot of information about it. It is about 200 times sweeter than sugar. So even though aspartame does have some calories, because we have to use so little of it to get the same sweetness on our taste buds as sugar, that's pretty negligible because we just don't have to use so much of it. But it's generally found in sodas, gums, yogurts, variety of desserts, and medicines. So like sugar-free cough syrups, things like that, you will find aspartame. Most common brands are Equal and NutraSweet. So think about aspartame as the blue packet, your Equal packet. One interesting factoid is that you cannot bake with aspartame. You can with sucralose and you can with saccharin, you can with some of these others. You do not want to bake with aspartame because once it's heated, it loses all of its sweetness. So it's not something that you would put in a cake in place of sugar, for example. Whereas sucralose, otherwise known as Splenda, we see this a lot on the market. This is the yellow packet. It's 600 times sweeter than standard sugar. So again, really don't have to use so much of it. And basically speaking, Splenda, if we look at, or sucrose, if we look at it under a microscope, it's a sugar molecule, but it's had a chlorine added to it, a chlorine molecule added to it, so that when it gets into our body says, we don't know what this is because sugar shouldn't have chlorine, so it just passes on through. Again, should not provide any calories or impact blood sugars. You can bake with this, which is why Splenda is probably one of the most popular artificial sweeteners out there that we see in the baking aisle. They do bake blends. They've got brown sugar alternatives. You can bake with it and it doesn't lose its sweetness. Saccharin, this one's been around a while, officially since 1879. Saccharin is lab made like all of these others. This one, some people notice a bitter aftertaste, so it's not used as often, but we do find it in processed goods, canned fruit, sugar-free gums, and another interesting factoid, doesn't mean you can't do it, but do know that saccharin can pass through the placenta. So if you are pregnant or know anybody that is, this might be one to steer away from just during the pregnancy, focusing on something else, just so there's no risk of it passing through the placenta into the baby. Herbal sweeteners. This one's popular, new, Stevia, probably the most popular brand out there. Stevia is a natural plant, and there is a specific compound within the leaves or within this plant that is manufactured or that is produced, processed to make your stevia product. It is a sweet compound found within this plant, and that's how we're getting these stevia or truvia products out there. It has been long time used in South America, again, as the full plant. So I know some folks will buy a stevia plant, they'll keep it on their windowsill, and they will take a leaf off and they will steep it in their tea, they will steep it in their coffee, and it'll get that natural extract from the leaf. Please know that the products that you're purchasing on the market are still highly processed products. And when you open up the bag, you don't see a bunch of cut up leaves. We see that white powdery stuff or liquids. We can find stevia in liquids. So this, again, practice moderation in any of these processed foods. It is digested and can be absorbed, but we use very little of it, and it should have very little impact on your blood sugars. And you can bake with it. So it's another one of those that the sweetness is still there after it is heated. So you can put it into your baked goods as an alternative to regular sugar. And again, like any of these other ones, it has that GRAS or generally recognized as safe labeling according to the FDA. Monk fruit extracts, this one I think is less common, but still out there. And this comes from the Chinese monk fruit melon. And it's often mixed with other sugar substitutes. So if you do find this out on the market, please make sure that you check the label to see if it's added with other sugars. A lot of times we'll mix and match and put it with other things. So it might not be 100% carb-free, calorie-free. It is 150 to 200 times sweeter than regular sugar. So again, not something that we need to use a lot of. We can generally use it in smaller amounts. It's not as easy to find as our stevias and our splendas, but it is out there. A lot of times natural food stores will have this in their baking or their sugar aisle as an alternative. It does have 0 calories and 0 carbs, but again, if it is mixed with something like dextrose or some other sugar, it is going to contribute a little bit of that glycemic index or some calories to it. You can find monk fruit extract as a liquid, granules, or powder. And some people do report that it has an aftertaste. It is heat stable like most of these other ones, so you can bake with it. Remember, aspartame is just the one that you don't want to bake with because you're going to be left with a very disappointing end game. It doesn't taste as sweet because we deactivated those sweetness compounds when we heated them up. Now, like I mentioned, the safety of these things, they're all out on the market and they're all recognized as safe to consume. The National Cancer Institute shows no proof at this point that they cause cancer. Heard that one a lot with aspartame and some of those artificial sweeteners, but there's no hardcore concrete proof that it does that. So again, it's okay to consume them. Please practice moderation. Do know, though, that some of the newest research that's coming out is showing some type of relationships. So, like I mentioned about your healthy gut bacteria, in regard to diabetes management and blood sugar management, The relationship between a healthy gut environment and glucose management, or the body's ability to manage blood sugars, they're showing more and more of a connection. So if we've got an unhealthy gut, it makes it harder for the body to manage those blood sugars appropriately. Well, if we know that a high intake of artificial sweeteners can sometimes disrupt that healthy gut environment, well, kind of a downstream effect, we might be using these artificial sweeteners as low carb, low sugar alternatives, but they might actually be making it harder for our body to self manage our blood sugars. Is there a link to that type 2 diabetes? One thing about that insulin resistance, when we consume something that is sweet, or we talk about weight gain, when we consume something that is sweet, our brain registers, taste buds just told me that there was sweetness on the tongue. That must mean that we're about to get the ability to make blood sugar. The body kind of gets primed and ready to say, okay, we're going to need to make insulin. We're going to get this energy. And then when it gets to the stomach and the stomach says, no, there's nothing here. This isn't sugar. We're not getting any energy. It can kind of leave the body primed to want to fill that, right? And so they're showing this relationship of high intake of diet drinks, diet soda specifically, or artificial sweeteners can actually lead to weight gain, which doesn't make sense unless we look at the full diet. And if that person or their brain is like primed and ready to get that sugar, get that sugar, get those carbs, well, it might look to other foods outside of the diet soda to get it. And over the course of the day, might actually consume more calories or more carbs than had they just done the real sugar in a smaller amount. Or when we think about that insulin resistance, if our body, once it senses, hey, there's sweetness on the tongue, but then doesn't get that sugar, it might have started to produce some insulin in anticipation. Well, now we've got insulin that has nothing to do because we didn't make any blood sugars, and there are some questions around it. So I am always a proponent of whole food as much as possible, limit our processed options, limit our lab made options as much as possible, pick and choose specifically or strategically where they make the most sense. So, for example, if you are unwilling to give up your sugar free hazelnut coffee creamer in the morning, totally fine. Maybe you're willing to, instead of doing Crystal Lights or some of those flavored diet beverages, you're going to naturally infuse your water. And instead of putting raspberry Crystal Light in, you're going to take 2 or 3 strawberries, throw it into the water. Boom. Now you have a naturally infused water beverage, and you cut out those extra artificial sweeteners that you were getting later in the day. So just be mindful about, or I should say intentional about when you're consuming them, because as with everything, everything in moderation, and just because this thing doesn't have calories or carbs doesn't make it a free for all, because too much of anything can get us into trouble.